as we will start around 5 to 7 minutes from now. But for those who are jumping in, it's great to have you as always. In terms of what's going on in my life, I am scheduled to try to run a long run this Friday. I've been prepping for a marathon, and so I'm going to try to attempt a 20-mile run this Friday. So in terms of those who are believers, if you're watching, please pray for me, as my knees always irritate me when I up my mileage. Specifically, I have what's called IT band syndrome, where there's your IT band that goes from your hip all the way down to your knee, kind of into the front of it. And every time I increase my mileage, it tends to get more irritated. And as a result, I tend to have to rest, and I'm not able to usually complete these longer mile runs. So that's what I'll be up to. That's what I'm up to towards the end of this week, going on in my world. But in terms of what's going on in y'all's lives, I can't engage other than what you leave in the chat. So please feel free to comment, share what's going on with you, so that I can offer some sort of commentary. But as I said, we'll take a few minutes, as we always do, 5 to 7 minutes, and we will get rolling. Good to be with you all, as usual. Looking forward to Ecclesiastes tonight. We will start towards the end of chapter 6, work our way to chapter 7, verse 18. We'll start at chapter 6, verse 10. I find this particular passage of Scripture to be helpful, because it acts kind of as a hinge in the book. But we'll wait. We'll give people a chance to get in here. In fact, as people are getting in here, I'm going to go grab my iPad so that I can make sure I'm seeing what you guys are seeing. So give me just a second. I don't know where you guys are. I am in the South, and it has been incredibly warm. Not incredibly warm. It's not warm by our standards in Georgia, but it's been much warmer than it has been. I'm used to having a heater running the whole time while I'm doing these studies, but tonight it is actually very warm, and that's because it's finally heating up again. But I think again we're going to get a cold front in the next few days. Hey Bobby, good to have you here with us as always. Yeah, in Kentucky, muggy. What part of Kentucky are you in? I was in Louisville for about 6 or 7 years, and yeah, I remember some hot days. I remember some cold days. In Augusta, growing up, we had some snow every now and then, but never really that much. And so I just have always been used to real warm, humid environments. I get to Kentucky, and I remember one year in particular, got down to 0 degrees. And then there was a wind chill factor below 0, and I just thought, I just don't understand. Don't understand the point of that temperature. Hey, Luke, great to have you with us. Jen, as always, Lower Alabama, yeah, it's hot there. It is getting into spring, getting warm, which I'm very grateful for. I love the heat, but tonight I've gotten so used to the cold that the warmer weather has been a bit of a surprise. Grateful for it. Okay, southern Kentucky, right on the Tennessee border. Okay, so you're used to some warm winters and some warm summers and cold winters. San Diego, that's excellent. I'm sure it's always wonderful there. Today was warm for March in Pennsylvania. Cold and snowy winter even recently, so today's 70-degree weather was amazing. Yeah, so even here in Augusta, so growing up, I have very few memories of snow incidents. The last 2 years here, we've had several snow events. I mean, especially this year, when we were trying to reconstitute as a church, we had to cancel service for 2 Sundays in a row, which here in Augusta, that's unheard of. Like, cold weather never results in having to close the church, but we had to do that, and yet, all of a sudden, it's really warm here, so that's great. Glad y'all are enjoying some, not only have you had some cold and snowy winter, but also already getting some wonderfully warm weather. I love the heat, love the spring, love the just everything coming to life, and looking forward to maybe doing some camping with my boys. But let me go ahead. It's 9:05, so I'll go ahead and pray, and we'll get rolling. I just encourage you guys to jump into Ecclesiastes. Winter in Idaho has been extremely mild. Oh, really? Wow, that's interesting. Just because I know here in the Southeast, it's been unusually cold, and I don't know what to make of that other than it's been unusually cold, and we've gotten on snow, so my boys have loved it. But that's interesting that your winter out there has been more mild. Strange. The weather's strange. I think there's a reason Jesus pointed to it in John chapter 3. Is it demonstrates how little mankind understands the world, the weather especially, and how much more do we not understand the things of the Spirit. But let me go ahead and pray for us, and we will dig into Ecclesiastes chapter 6 and 7 this evening. God, I thank you for these brothers and sisters. Thank you for the chance to open your word with them. I pray that we would be sobered by the perspective that the preacher gives us. I do pray if we have any unbelievers among us that they will consider how little man knows, and that they might cast themselves upon you, that they might see their need not to rely upon their own wisdom and understanding, but instead to look to Christ, their King. I pray that they would see him as faithful, not only as one to lead them wisely, but one who has come from you and offered himself in the place of sinners on their behalf. So I pray that you would grant us sight through your word this evening. I thank you for these saints that are with us and any unbelievers. We pray that you'd be glorified in our time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I live in Ohio. We have very bipolar weather. Today it was in the 70s. Tomorrow winter's back. Yeah, so here in Georgia we've had really warm weather this week, which has been I love it. But I think by Friday it's going to jump down again to the 20s and 30s, which is frustrating because that's when I was going to do my long run. But that's the way it goes. So tonight we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 6. We're starting towards the end of chapter 6, starting at verse 10. And then we are going to work through to the end of chapter 7, verse 18. And this passage in particular is more of 81 today. That's beautiful. I love hot weather. So, but the 80s are great. I'm looking forward to that here. Hey, good morning, Paul. Great to have you with us. Cold weather tomorrow. North Carolina weather's bipolar. Yeah. It's a good time. We get a little bit of the cold, which is great for fires, but then we also get the heat, which I personally look forward to. I love the heat. But Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10, all the way to the end of chapter 7, verse 18. Now, let me remind you, this passage, or really this book, has been dealing with what I've titled Deconstructing Atheism. And we come tonight to a hinge in the book, which means if there's any skeptics among us, you're going to find that this is less engaging perhaps your presuppositions and offering an alternative. We've spent the first 6 chapters of the book kind of tearing down some of the major assumptions of atheism, and looking, atheism tends to rely upon the knowledge of God, or the knowledge of man, the ability of his hands to build a better world. And the preacher has gone from one thing to the next to say, ultimately, that's a really shaky foundation. So tonight we're actually looking at what the preacher begins to construct in its place. In other words, if you're wondering why this is less focused on atheism tonight and more focused on an alternative, it's because we've been deconstructing atheism for about 7 or 8 weeks now, and we're really looking at what the preacher wants to replace it with. So I'd encourage you, if you have objections, I know it's not convenient, go back and listen to the first 7 or 8 episodes. Hey, thank you for the birthday wishes. I appreciate that. I am 1 year away from 40, and I'm not sure what to make of that. But anyways, thank you very much. So let's jump into Ecclesiastes, and what I want you to see this evening is, or perhaps where we would start, is we might start with the problem of evil. In fact, I'm going to go to the book to get us started. And by book, I mean the book that I wrote, because I think it'll do a better job of summarizing where I'm going. But I'll start here. I was once asked by an atheist, how can you believe in a loving God who would create a man and a woman who could so easily fall into sin, bringing about the suffering we see today? So that you might call this the problem of evil. As I think about that question, the typical replies cycle through my mind. God gave man free will. So I'll pause there for a moment. How would you answer that? It's not uncommon for a skeptic to pose to a Christian, how can you believe in a God who would will such a world to exist or things like evil exist? How would you answer? What would your response be? 40 at one time, it wasn't too bad. Am I going to put the questions in all caps on screen? Let's see if I can. There we go. I got it. Sorry, I don't play enough with OBS. The only time I touch OBS is when I'm with you guys. And so really every week, it's like a new learning experience for me. But again, how do you respond to the problem of evil? If an unbeliever comes to you and says, hey, I don't believe in God because how could an all-powerful, all-good God allow for X, Y, Z? And think about the different responses you might give. Now, Lewis's response tends to dominate contemporary Christian apologetics. Namely, well, God gave man free will, and that's the explanation for the existence of evil in the world. But what I want to draw your attention to this evening is that's actually not the route that the preacher takes. That's not the route. And I think that's important for us. So let's look real briefly at what the preacher says. I could start here. Let me start a little further, though. I'll start at the end. No, I'm going to start back up there. Sorry. We'll go back there. Chapter 6. We are at chapter 6, verse 10. Whatever has come to be has already been named. And I think what the preacher's talking about here is he's already addressed all of life through the earlier chapters of the book. And he's exposed what man is. It's known what man is. And here's his point about the problem of evil. That man is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. So the preacher has already explained how the world works. We're stuck in this cycle. Remember that, this is really all the way back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, the hamster wheel. That the world is in a particular cycle and man cannot break free. The preacher has shown through his own experience what man is, that we are answerable to death. Human judgment is no better than the beasts. Wealth is not secure. We could go on, but really through the first 6 chapters, he's exposed how futile the work of the hands of man are. And you might remember the question that he brings up right here: who can make straight what he has made crooked? Right. This is really from chapter 1, right? We go all the way back to chapter 1. Right down here. What is crooked cannot be made straight. But look where the preacher is now. He's making the point that it is God who's made it crooked, right? Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? So we've moved further. Not only is the world crooked and man does not have the power to fix it, but now the preacher explicitly states that this has been the work of God. Who can make straight what God has made crooked? And so something about the problem of evil is meant to expose not God, but you and I, our own limitations. So that's his point here at the very beginning. Whatever has come to be has already been named. Preacher's already addressed the cycle that man is stuck in. He's already addressed the limitations of man. He's exposed us for the frailty and the weakness of our own hands. And more importantly, he's shown that you and I are not able to dispute with one stronger than he, namely God. Let me pause there for a minute, make sure I'm addressing questions. What's going on? Good to have you with us. Let's see. All worldviews have unsatisfying answers to why evil exists. Thus, it's not grounds to dismiss the God of the Bible. However, Christ has actually experienced evil and can thus sympathize. Yeah, absolutely. Lucino, that's Garcia, that's Hebrews, right? Jesus has put on flesh, been tempted in every way that we are, yet he himself is without sin. But here, what the preacher has dealt with so far through the book, he's named the broad picture, the broad spectrum. It's been named. Man has been revealed for what we are. Why does he call himself the preacher? So that's just the title throughout the book is the one who addresses, that's why the book's called Ecclesiastes, that comes from both the Greek and the Latin titles for the book, which comes really from the Hebrew verb kahal. Kahal is the word for an assembly. And so in the Greek, it's the ecclesia. And so Ecclesiastes is the one who addresses the ecclesia, or the kahal. So we call it Ecclesiastes because it's about the preacher addressing the assembly. And the preacher in this case is the Davidic king. And while it doesn't actually reveal that the preacher's name is Solomon, it tells us that he is a son of David during a part of Israel's history where Jerusalem was at its height. And of course, this man, as we saw in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, gave himself to the pursuit of women. And so it makes sense as it's been historically interpreted to be the words of Solomon. Yeah, Ecclesiastes 7 has been a great blessing to you, drawing near to God amidst mourning, taking it in heart. Yeah, it's a great chapter. But in terms of the question, the problem of evil, what I want to draw your attention to is, make sure I'm just now seeing that not all of the text is on your screen. So let me make sure I get all of it there. So whatever has come to be has already been named. All right. So the preacher is hinging. And what I mean by that is we've kind of come to the middle of the book where he's now summarizing everything that he's just done. He's addressed that he's kind of unveiled the world. We're in a cursed world where we're stuck in this cycle and no one can break free from it. And if it's your agenda to try to prove otherwise, please go watch the 6 or 7 videos we've already done. Secondly, it's been known what man is. Man does not have the ability to climb out of this condition because he's not able to dispute with one stronger than he, as the preacher says. Well, who is that? It's God. That's what we're going to see through the chapter. The Lord has designed the world in this way in light of the fall, and you and I cannot escape. Thus, verse 11, the more words, the more vanity, the more hebel. The more the more man runs his mouth, the more man tries to save himself or to offer his own perspective as the exhausting wisdom, the more fruitless, right? The more it is like chasing wind in a net. Because what is the advantage to man? And here's why. Why does the preacher think this way? Who knows, and this is going to be really, really important, what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Or who can tell what will be after him under the sun? I always think that if Ecclesiastes isn't Solomon, it was written about Solomon. Yeah, Luke, I agree. It's certainly Solomonic in style, in every way. Seems to be the embodiment of the son of David, the wisest king Israel knew. We have 20 people here. Yeah. So let me show you real briefly the hinge that's taking place in the book. So we've gone from, so here's what the preacher has taught us so far. And I don't know why all of this is highlighted. My computer is going to struggle with this, so I'm just not going to bother with it. But so we've looked so far in Ecclesiastes. Mankind is stuck in a cycle. Chapter 2, the preacher attempted to rebuild Eden. It failed. Chapter 3, we saw that time actually exposes that all things are under God's purposes and man is limited. Chapter 4 shows us that there's not going to be any lasting deliverance. Rather, there's going to be oppression from human government. Chapter 5, the religious are even marked by a disregard for God. That was the stupid worship everywhere last week. And chapter 6 taught us that human wealth offers no lasting alternative because it also is unreliable. So we come to chapter 7, where what he wants to do is he wants to now shift and to expose how limited human knowledge is. And let me show you what I mean. I could jump to the text for a moment, but instead I'm just going to show you right here. So we have Ecclesiastes 6, 10 to 12. And you'll see right here, here's that 4 I was just pointing out a minute ago. Who knows? Hey, that's the question he wants you to reflect on. If you were to look all around humanity, who knows what's good for man? And that should sound a little bit like Genesis, right? It should sound like Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 1, right? That everything God did was good for humanity. But the preacher, in light of the fall, is asking the question, who knows what's good for man? And what the secularist wants to say is that, Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, Richard Dawkins, they want to tell you that mankind has with himself the seeds of his own improvement. But the preacher wants to be more skeptical. The preacher does not believe Sam Harris. He doesn't believe Richard Dawkins. And he doesn't believe Steven Pinker. Because I'm going to show you some of these verses here. You can write them down. Go look them for yourself. Ecclesiastes 7:14. First, you cannot find out anything that will be after you. So he wants to show you already humanity and our knowledge is limited. But look what happens if we keep going. In Ecclesiastes 8, verse 7, he does not know what is to be. 8, verse 17, man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However he may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. Just keep going. I'm just drawing this out because I want you to see. I was at a preaching conference recently, and they talked about a book's. I can't remember exactly what they called it. They called it like the book's rhythmic meter, essentially. But the point is that every book of the Bible has kind of a general tone or general rhythm to it. The general rhythm of Ecclesiastes is that the knowledge of man is incredibly limited. And so what I have here on screen is a collection of those verses showing you this. Man cannot find out the work that is to be done under the sun. Man does not know. Man does not know his time. No man knows what is to be. You know not what disaster may happen on the earth. You do not know the work of God who makes everything. You do not know which will prosper. And I don't think we contemplate this enough. And so here's where I'm going with my original question. I was once asked by an atheist, how can you believe in a loving God who would create a man and woman who could so easily fall into sin to bring about the sufferings we see today? As I think about that question, the typical replies cycle through my mind. God gave man free will. It isn't love if there isn't a choice. Devil tempted them. God planned to use man's wicked choices to bring about a better good. As I've thought about how to respond over the years, Ecclesiastes 6, verse 10 to 7:18 has convinced me many of those responses, while well-intentioned, are unhelpful. What if the answer is not to get God, quote, off the perceived hook in the questioner's mind? What if a person really needs to be confronted with a different perspective about who they are? What if the answer is to hold up a mirror to the person asking the question and say something like this? Friend, I think your question is fine to ask, but I'm not sure you framed it correctly. Let me ask you this. Do you know the day of your death? Can you tell me whether or not the U.S. will be a united nation 100 years from now? Can you tell me the results of the next presidential election, given how little you and I know about our own lives? Have you even considered we are not prepared to evaluate the ethics of God to make the world in the way that he has? Again, I'm not trying to get believers off the hook, but when I look at Ecclesiastes 6-7, the preacher offers us a completely different perspective, right? Right here in verse 10, man is not able to go to war, to go to conflict, to dispute with God. And so man just runs his mouth for no purpose and to no advantage. None of us really know what's good for us. The few days that are in our vain life, passing like a shadow. For which of us can tell what will be after us? Incredibly humbling. Do I think it's because there's too much knowledge to know, or because our brains are limited in understanding? So I think the preacher's point is that mankind's knowledge, it's not that there's too much knowledge. Well, I mean, there is too much knowledge. But more than that, our brains really are limited. Like, we don't have access. If you remember from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, he taught that you and I were like a puzzle piece. There was a big picture that you and I desire to know, but we don't have access to it. I mean, if you were to think, I mean, right now, anyone who wants to tell you about how you ought to live, they themselves cannot tell you how their own life is going to come to an end. None of us can tell you with any sort of certainty who the next president will be. Who's going to win the World Series in the year 2026? When we sit back and really look at what man knows, it's incredibly little. And that's the point the preacher's getting at. Who are humans to think they can dispute with God? That's really where he's been going. Again, we're in this cursed world, and we think that we can build a better world apart from God. And so for 6 chapters, he's been going, no, we're stuck in a cycle. The Red Sox better not win. It's not going to be the Braves. Braves have been awful. They were awful last year. I don't know what they're going to do this year, but I hope it's not the Red Sox. Actually, I'd be okay if it's the Red Sox. Most of my family is from Boston, so just as I'm for the Patriots, I don't mind a Red Sox win. But again, the preacher wants you to look at the limitations of man. Trying to make sure I get the rest of it in there. I didn't realize how I'd cut some of it off from the screen. So, whatever has come to be has already been named, determined, if you will. Man has been exposed for what he is. And what we see is that man can't dispute with one stronger than he. Don't trial and error with sin as the preacher has. Yeah, it's a great reminder. The preacher tells us this to keep us from sin and rebellion. So the more words, the more vanity. What's the advantage of man? There isn't one. So I tell you all this to say the preacher this evening, he wants you to see that there are actually built-in functions, if you will, to help you wake up and see that you are not in control, and that instead of running your mouth in opposition to God, you ought to listen instead. That's where we're going. We have the puzzle. God holds the final piece, so that's why we'll never know. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that's part of it. How is that humbling or great? What happens after us is a question that literally everyone's asked. The text did not even answer. It just repeated what everyone has thought and ended with a question. Sure, the point, though, is not, hey, I've just got one more question along with everyone else. It actually offers an alternative, right? That's where chapter 7 is going. So whereas we've been tearing down for many weeks, now the preacher is going to offer us the alternative. And I want you to see, you can see the repetition here, right? You see the word better over and over again. This is the Hebrew word tov. It's the same word you meet in Genesis chapter 1 that God saw, and it was very good. And so here you have the repetition of that word. I think the preacher is showing us in the light of the fall, there's a particular path of wisdom that we ought to take. So here's a better way. It's better. It's better. It's better. It's better. Better. It's good. Same word. On and on. The point here is that we live in this upside down world, and he is going to offer us a path of wisdom. So that's what I mean by the hinge of the book. Whereas the beginning of the book has expressed we are stuck in this cycle, the second half of the book is going to communicate that man's knowledge is incredibly limited. So what man needs is not to see and to observe and depend upon his own wisdom, but rather to rely upon the wisdom that comes from God. And so that's ultimately what begins to be revealed here, is wisdom from God. Yeah. The book answers it later by saying the Spirit returns to God. Absolutely. The end of Ecclesiastes chapter 12. If you're wondering where this book is going, you can read that, where the preacher will summarize his position, and the interpreter of Ecclesiastes will recommend it as well. So what's going to happen tonight, then, is in response to all of this, is we're going to get what I've called in when I wrote it as a book or summarized it in my preaching is, while the world is upside down, we're going to get upside down wisdom. You might call it wisdom that's paradoxical, wisdom that you might not expect. And so we'll begin to dive into that. Here it is, 7 verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment. And I have a son who is near teenage years, and so we're teaching him about deodorant. Deodorant is a wonderful thing. So, and this axiom here, a good name is actually better than deodorant. The point being, while there is something to worrying about outward appearance, there's actually something better you can acquire, a good name. Again, it's not saying don't worry about how you smell, but if you had to pick between your character and your smell, it's actually your character that is better than what people think of you, right? Or outward appearance. A good name, if you're to prioritize one over the other, prioritize your character over your smell is the point. Yeah, Stephen Covey didn't write the book in Hebrew, and so he wasn't banking on the repetition of the Hebrew word for tov in Genesis chapter 1. So I appreciate your perspective, but Covey is not at all writing in the tradition of Hebrew literature. So again, the use of the word better here is not because it's in the English word better, it's because it's the repetition of the Hebrew word tov, which is offering us not merely a perspective on how to live a good life. It's actually a return back to Genesis 1 and 2. Well, if we stink, nobody wants to get closer to us, even to get to know our character. That's probably true. However, that's more of a modern luxury, right? Historically, people went a long time without taking baths, without smelling good, right? And that's what the preacher's aiming at here is, if you've got to pick between the two, it's better actually to be a person of character than to be devoted to making yourself outwardly attractive. And isn't that the irony? We give ourselves to outward attraction, right? Whether it's how we smell, how we look, we spend much more time worried about our appearance than we do our character. Now, that's not his main point. He sets that up to say, in the same way, are you ready? The day of death is actually better than the day of birth, right? The day of your death is actually better than the day of birth. And that's really where these next few verses are going to go. We have something to learn. And birth is a moment of celebration, but in light of the fall, death actually does more to sober us than birth. And that's where he's going. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Why should any of us care what this book says? Well, we should care because it's from God. So if God speaks, you and I ought to give regard to what he's saying. That's not the same thing as saying that you recognize that this text is from God. However, it's been historically received as a text inspired by God. Those who have sought what the Lord has said have recognized that God speaks through this book. So you and I ought to care about what this book says because it's from God. What's up, Reagan? Good to have you with us. Let's see. What reason can I give you to think the book is truthful? I just encourage you to read it. See if you what reason is there to disagree with it? I think you can jump in and you can attempt to take a passage out of context and misrepresent it. But I don't think, in light of its context, I don't think you could give a reason to mistrust it. If death is better, then why do people try to stay alive so much? Well, I don't think the book is saying that death is better. I think the book is saying there is something more to be learned from death than from birth. So he's not saying here that we should prefer death over birth. He's saying that for those who are alive, and I'm reading this from the context, right? It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. So his vision is not those who are dead, it's those who are still alive. They actually gain more, not from celebrating the arrival of a new child, but from mourning somebody who has died. So the focus is on those who are still living. So it's not telling us, hey, it's better to be dead than alive here. Where is God from right now? He's everywhere. Am I sure it's from God? Yes, absolutely. 1 Corinthians 2, nobody knows the mind of a man, but his spirit. So it is with the mind of God by the Spirit. So I trust this because through the power of the Spirit, I've been compelled to recognize this is from our Creator. Is historical reception equivalent to truth? Not in a vacuum. It depends. There's more variables than that. Certainly, I'm not telling you that because you read it, it's true. I'm telling you to read it such that you would weigh it and see if what it's saying is outlandish. How do I know the news is good? Because it's changed my life. It's in the Bible. It's the Word of God. Absolutely, Bobby. How do I know it's the Word of God? There's a multitude of ways that I know. I know, again, as I've mentioned just a moment ago, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, I'm persuaded through the Spirit. I'm persuaded through its historical veracity. I'm persuaded through the lives of the men who once ran from it and yet boldly died defending and promoting it. Am I not accepting this rather than being convinced? No. So I used to, Kim, I don't know how to say your name, so I don't mean this. I don't mean this disrespectfully. I don't know how to say your name. But your question is, am I not just accepting this? No. I didn't grow up in church. I grew up as a skeptic, as an atheist. I actually was transformed through reading this text, spending time studying it, and I was... Sorry, I think I tapped my mic. I became convinced of its truth. I don't know it's the word. Yeah, I think I answered that. Let's see. That's fine. If you don't believe that the Bible is the Word of God, your skepticism does not hinder our belief for a variety of different reasons. Let's see. Yeah, they tend to roll in when we get started. you're welcome to say you have no reason to believe it. That's not the same thing as having studied it responsibly. Yes, the day of death is better than the day of birth. It is explicit in the text, but he's talking to people who are still alive. So yes, if I isolate that verse, you can say that it's talking about your death, but very clearly the preacher is speaking to people who are still alive. The point that he's making is that there's something to be gained by going and observing death rather than birth. Let's see. Yes, questions in all caps is more helpful. Let's see. All right. So I think I've dealt with a few questions for now. We'll keep going. So I've highlighted all this in blue here because what the preacher wants to do is he wants to address the tendency of what skepticism does among us is it drives us towards complacency. It drives us towards celebration and a tendency to want to ignore the difficulty of death. And here you see it in verses 2 and onward. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Okay, so there's something to be gained by going to a funeral home that you don't get if you just go to, I don't know, what image comes to mind to you? I think of a frat house that's always partying, for example. That's the contrast. There's something to be gained at a funeral home that a frat house that's always partying cannot give you. For this is where you're going. Without a doubt, 100%, you are going to end up dead. And thus, the living there is not simply a reference to all those who still have breath within their lungs, but those who are on the path of wisdom. What the living do is they lay to heart the meaning of death. They don't just ignore it. They don't shove it under the rug. They don't just spend their days at the house of feasting. They try to learn what death is teaching, right? Goes on. For this reason, sorrow is actually better than laughter. Right? There are those who try to spend their days who don't want to stare at death. They try to forget via laughter. The preacher says, actually, to those who are wise, sorrow will actually do you some good. To those who want to cast off your creator and YOLO your way through life, what you actually need is you need some sorrow. For, and here's the reason why, right? That's a purpose statement there. By sadness of face, the heart is made glad. There's something actually to be gained by grief. But again, if secularism is true, there's nothing to be gained. But the preacher says, actually, in light of what God is doing, there's actually something to be gained through mourning and death. Trying to catch up with comments. Let's see. The meaning of life can be found in the book of Ecclesiastes. I think so. I agree. Why can't aversion to death be merely biological? Why must there be a spiritual component to this? Well, I think biology doesn't ask for meaning. You can't reduce it to biology. Biology doesn't care about meaning. If it's truly biological, it simply is. But here you are discussing this with us because biology isn't sufficient to exhaust the explanation of death. Be skeptic makes you lazy? ? Not believing things without requiring evidence. Tell me more. I think if you think you only hold to things that you have evidence for, you are either lazy or you have not understood how your belief works. Or the very assertion that you only believe in what you have evidence for is itself philosophical. That is not evidential. So you haven't even passed your own criteria. Yes, we do know objective morality exists, for we cannot operate without it. Man who rose from the grave spoke about the Old Testament as God speaking directly. Absolutely. Why can't you just be a brain in a flesh suit? Well, because you'd be inconsistent. You operate as if you are more than that. You're welcome to try to be a brain in a flesh suit. You're just not going to do it consistently. The book says that, but you have no reason to think it actually happened. I have every reason to trust it. So I'm not sure what you mean when you say, no, I have no reason. In other words, there's historic, there's all sorts of historical witness to the veracity of it. Solomon's wisdom. Sorry, guys, just trying to catch up real quickly because I know we've got a lot to go through tonight. There's nothing wrong with assigning meaning a posteriori. However, what we determine or how we apply meaning to things a posteriori, and I know I haven't said it right, is still going to be determined to some degree by what we assume a priori. So I don't think you can just do that without already having pre-commitments. Still, it's a book. I have no idea if any of that happened. I'm not sure what point you're making, Professor Hizzle, when you say that, because the book itself, it's more principial. So I don't know what you're getting at when you object to that. It's me who reduces us to your God's property. I recognize that my assumption is that you and I belong to God. I wouldn't lie about that. But I'd say it's you who reduce yourself to nothing more than mere the product of space stuff. So I don't know what you're getting at. Let's see. Why must we assume anything a priori? Well, your reasoning requires it, I would say. You cannot come to conclusions about reality apart from a priori assumptions. Why not merely observe? Well, to observe is to already commit to trusting, for example, the data gathered by your senses. So you have some a priori assumptions already. I appreciate that, Professor Hizzle. You observe a subjective fluid morality competing with other moralities. I appreciate your your perspective. However, even drawing that conclusion, you have already made moral assumptions by which your framework chooses how to categorize morality. All right, I think I've caught up. Good discussion, guys. Thank y'all. We'll keep going. So anyways, there's something to be gained by observing death. And that's where he's going. Verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of face, the heart is made glad. Now, here's what he's getting at. So I had a family friend. I grew up, here in Augusta. I've told y'all that. I had a best friend who, I spent my summers with his family, his mom, for really most of. I think we met when we were 5, and I just spent my summers there up for the next, 12 to 13 years. His mom played a huge role in my life. And she passed away last year randomly from a heart attack at an urgent care. And what the preacher's getting at here in verse 3 is that there is actually more to be gained in that than just sort of, and when it says laughter, it's not criticizing laughing. It's the sort of haughty laugh that attempts to avoid facing sorrow. And you can see that here. By sadness of face, the heart is made glad. And the point is that the means of understanding the world actually comes through sadness rather than mere jovial, light neglect of facing the truth. There's something to be gained by facing the world as it is. Thank you, Clyde. And here, so he goes on to explain the heart of the wise. Okay, if you want to know if you're really wise, then you contemplate what happens at funerals. But the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. So here's the criticism is that you and I can choose to go to the grave, to attend funerals, to contemplate what death means, to listen to those abiding over funerals, to listen to the sobriety of what is taught by those preaching at funerals, or you go to the house of mirth. You got to drink every night. You're just playing record after record, album after album. You're just trying to forget the pain. You're just giving yourself to forgetfulness. Those who are wise in this world, they listen. They listen to what the grave means. Man, what's up, Adam? It's a real treat to have you with us. I really appreciate your comment. Joy to have you here. Gosh, it's been a decade. It's been a decade, and it's a real treasure to have you show up here. Paul said 500 have seen Jesus, not from one of the 500. No one that ever seen Jesus or anything. Skeptic philosophy. So Paul's point to Corinth when he says that, I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, is, hey, Corinth, you can actually go deliberate with those people. So he's actually making a point that they could go verify within their day. So the way you're understanding Paul there, I think, misunderstands his point. Those who saw Jesus, the Corinthians could have gone and questioned. So I'm not sure I think you're misusing him there. You want to deconstruct atheism, all you have to do is provide evidence that any God exists. Foghorn, I appreciate your thought. However, when you tell me to provide evidence that any God exists, you've actually already assumed a criteria for the existence of God, and you're arbitrarily assuming you can smuggle in what counts as evidence. So it's not as simple as you think. You actually need to be in a place of listening rather than telling me what counts for criteria for God. Let's see. Thank you. I wish I could read y'all's names. I just don't know how to pronounce most of them. How could they do this? They never name them. Why? I mean, you assume they don't know who he's talking about. The assumption that... So Paul assumes there's correspondence between his appeal to 500 witnesses and the Corinthian church, because they're a first-generation group hearing. So when you say, how could they do this? He never named them. You're assuming they don't know them, whereas Paul's assuming they do. So the framework you're imposing on the text isn't there. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna keep going. Really appreciate you guys dialoguing, trying to address as I can. So for this reason, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The heart of fools is in the house of mirth. But he's going to go on. Just contemplate verse 5 for a moment. It's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. Now, if atheism is true, how could verse 5 be the case? If atheism is true, there's no such thing as the wise. And if atheism is true, there's no such thing of the fool. I mean, you can say, hey, there's general principles through patterns that we observe empirically, whatever. That doesn't make any of that meaningful. It's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise because death means something. And therefore, to give yourself to the song of fools go to the bar, listen to whatever, just trying to forget, not face the pains of life. You can give yourself to that, but that's foolish because there's actually a right way to live, and there's actually something after death, is the point. Verse 6, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. The idea is that thorns make a loud noise when they're burning under pots. And you might think that, hey, all that sound and activity communicates power, influence, endurance, but really it's their own destruction. And so it is the laughter of fools. It's vanity. Yeah, there's a lot to be learned from our heartbreak. You tell us the criteria of evidence. What would you need for evidence that Zeus was God? Whatever standard you'd accept, I'll use that standard. Well, I'd asked for a revelation from him. I'd asked for revelation that is both transcendent and immanent. Yeah, I mean, Zeus hasn't left anything around for us to listen to. Thank you, Bobby. Let's see. Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to keep up with everything. A lot of good discussion. Trying to keep going. All right. We'll try to press our way through. We'll start at verse 7. So in verse 7, he continues to drive forward. Oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Now here the secularist tends to be driven by two assumptions. That intellect and money, can accomplish something. So the preacher's guarding us from that. He's recognizing that, hey, the reality of oppression exists, and it can actually be so difficult that even the wise are driven to madness. And at the same time, money corrupts the heart. Here's his point. Wisdom and money are not a guarantee of truth. No amount of wisdom can escape the fact that oppression can drive you to madness. And money can actually be used to manipulate. So don't think the answer lies in the wisdom of man, and don't think the answer lies in money. Verse 8. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning. What's the point of such a statement? The point is that instead of asserting a judgment before a thing has come to its conclusion, you wait, right? Isn't it the case that somebody who comes to the end of a thing has a better perspective than one who's still at the beginning? And you got to think about what that means for a minute. Anytime Richard Dawkins tells you what's going to happen at death, anytime Sam Harris tells you what's going to happen at death, anybody who tells you that they know that nothing happens after death, well, they're speaking from someone who still stands at the beginning. Why don't you wait till someone who's actually died to give you their perspective on the end of things, right? The patient in spirit is better than the proud who would claim to know something. This is kind of a paraphrase of what was already said. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Just as impatience is folly, somebody who wants to tell you how things are going to go once it's ended. So anger is driven by impatience. Verses 8 and 9 kind of parallel one another. Now, one of my favorite verses is right here in Ecclesiastes 7, verse 10. Let me get these out of the way for a minute. Let's see. Hey, been chilling on my TV. Hi, everyone. Death is so much more than birth because that's where our life joins. Yeah. Yeah. I find this is Ecclesiastes 7 verse 10 is an incredible perspective that I wish Christians would really weigh more of. What do you think for a moment? I've been watching all those videos right now that are going viral with, can't remember which Goo Goo Dolls song it is. It might be Iris. But it's saying, hey, how are things in the 90s? And then it cuts to some video from 30 years ago and Johnny Resnick singing, you know, whatever song. And my heart says, yes, that's when the world was better. Look at what the preacher says. Say not, why were the former days better than these? Right? That's the question we ask, right? Oh, if we just go back, then things would be better. We'd be better when this generation, when I was growing up. Preacher says, don't say that. Why? Here's the reason. It's a purpose statement. If you think that way, it's not from wisdom. You are not wise if you think the former days are better. You've been duped by nostalgia. Skeptic philosophy. Dan McClellan is about as driven as you can get by dogma. Dan is loaded with all sorts of dogma from the Enlightenment. And if you think he's not, you've been duped from his perspective. Let's see. Until after 30 years ago. Yeah, it's amazing. It's wild to think 30 years ago was a time when I was alive. That is amazing. Okay. How do I practically use this verse to fight against depression? Verse 10. Let me see. How do you use verse 10 to fight against depression? That's a great question. Well, first, I think depression sometimes can come from the fact that we think days gone by are better than days ahead. And I think the preacher's saying that's not the case. In fact, all days are really the same. More of our own naivety about the past and the future that causes us to think verse 10 is the case. But when we think of passages like Romans 8 or 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I think especially of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the things that are unseen are eternal. And that this present suffering doesn't compare to the glory that's going to be revealed to us. And so whether it's what we experienced in childhood or whatever we've experienced today, these things are temporary. They're momentary. They don't last, and they don't compare to what's coming. So I'd encourage you not to be deceived by your heart's longing for familiarity, because familiarity does not inherently mean better. It just means familiar. And what may be familiar to you is still just as difficult as things are today. And so give yourself to looking not to the past, but to what Christ will bring about. Thanks, Legit, for joining us. Let's see. Name a dogma that Dan holds. So Dan is committed to the cognitive science of religion. So Dan assumes naturalism, materialism. You can read about it all on his website. So he is namely driven by Enlightenment assumptions that naturalism or materialism can explain the existence of religion, which it can't. But what that perspective assumes is that religion can be exhausted out of our need for survival. So all sorts of assumptions about the world, I mean, even any perspective he gives from a scholastic perspective assumes that the history his selection of scholars have constructed is the authoritative perspective. Of course, it isn't the perspective that the majority of scholars hold. It's the majority of perspectives that secular scholars hold, which is why scholars like inspired airmen who recognize the predominant notion of biblical scholars are actually conservative would disagree with someone like Dan. All right, we'll keep going. So verse 10, I'm sorry. Let me draw attention to something for just a moment. Okay. So the wisdom can be driven into madness. However, verse 11, wisdom is still good. Don't think the preacher is throwing wisdom out. Wisdom with an inheritance is still beneficial. And here's why. Protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. So if you're a big Dave Ramsey fan and you're trying to get out of debt because you want to build up some savings, there's wisdom to that. But however, just like money, there's actually something better than money, namely wisdom. The advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Preacher is making the point that there is still something to be gained in this world. Therefore, don't abandon wisdom despite the difficulty of the cursed age that we're in. Yeah, Dan is dogmatically beholden to whatever can make Mormons. Yeah, I think he is very much driven by those presuppositions. Calming waves. Is there a particular perspective from Dan that you think I don't understand? I certainly haven't read everything that he's written. However, he and I have engaged some with one another. Skeptic philosophy, you seem to be getting more particular in response to me, which is fine. Is there a particular perspective you want me to respond to? Because I can keep telling you kind of broadly, generally, but I it seems like it might be more helpful for you to bring up, hey, what's a particular perspective you want me to engage? So, for example, I think his perspective on Jesus' claim to deity is very deliberately biased. I'll give you an example. In his understanding of Mark chapter 1, Dan says that Mark cites John 1, verses 2 to 3, and those passages in Mark 1, verses 2 to 3, they refer to a passage from Exodus, from Isaiah, and even from Malachi. And he recognizes that passage is about a messenger who's going to prepare a way for God. And in those passages, John the Baptist is the messenger that Mark has in view. Now, the reason that's important, so Dan would say, therefore, Mark doesn't recognize Jesus as God. However, if you go to Malachi 3 and you read Malachi 3, verse 1 in context, Malachi 3 is saying that not only is a messenger going to come, a messenger is going to come followed by Yahweh who will judge the temple. And therefore, what Mark 1 verses 2 to 3 is saying is not only is John the Baptist going to come, but John the Baptist is going to be followed by God himself who will judge the temple. And what do we see Jesus do in Mark's gospel? He comes immediately after John the Baptist, and then he confronts the religious leaders in the temple, and he judges them. So take it for what you will. But I think his biases drive him away from the obvious conclusion that Mark is making. All right, trying to keep up. Let's see. If I sound like I hate a professor, please forgive me, but you're in no position to claim God isn't real. Any Bible translation he said that I think is wrong and why? So I would say Mark 1. I'd go back to Mark 1. I think he yanks Mark 1 out of its context. And while he affirms the messenger in Mark 1 is John, I think he fails to acknowledge why that actually shows Mark is pointing to the deity of Christ. But anyway, we'll keep going. All right. Now here's the point, verse 13. Here's what the preacher's getting at. What the secularist needs to do, what all of humanity needs to do, is to consider the work of God. Who can make straight what God has made crooked? This goes back to chapter 1. The world is crooked. The world is crooked, and you and I can't make it straight. And so the point he's making is that you and I ought to see ourselves in a position of needing to learn. You and I need to put ourselves in a position of learning and listening, because you and I can't save the world. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. And what should we do in the day of adversity? You should think. You should meditate. God's made both, right? He's made the good days. He's made the bad days. Look at the purpose statement. Sorry, I can't highlight well. It always messes up. Man, here's the purpose statement. God makes the good days. He makes the days filled with adversity so that you and I will not find out anything that will be after him. This is what the skeptic needs to deal with. The skeptic makes assertions about the existence of God while he himself does not know what's coming next. That's the preacher's point. If you want to hold to atheism, you are asserting things that are far beyond your ability to know. And one of the things that makes that obvious is the days of joy, the days of adversity demonstrate God's made one as well as the other for the purpose that you can't find out what's coming next. My reasons for being an atheist were that I saw no reason to believe that God existed. When a friend asked me, really several years, I remember a friend in high school asking me if I believed in God. I had no reason to believe in him. I remember a friend at a park bench. They were sitting down with me as we were looking at the stars, and they asked if I had ever thought about who God was or what he was doing. And my answer was no. I saw no reason to believe in God. What do I mean by my video, Deconstructing Atheism? I simply mean that the point of the preacher in Ecclesiastes is he's deconstructing an approach to life that is built by the observation of man. A messenger followed by Yahweh. Can you translate that as John the Baptist? It's not just me that translates that skeptic philosophy. It's Dan McClellan interprets it that way. So my point was not merely that I translate it that way, it's that he interprets it that way. And if you take Malachi 3, for example, as referring to John the Baptist as the messenger, well, then the question immediately becomes, well, who's going to follow the messenger? Because in Malachi 3, verse 1 and following, it's the messenger followed by Yahweh, who says he's going to come judge his temple. And when Mark uses it, John the messenger appears, and then where you would expect Yahweh to appear, Jesus appears. And what does he do? Well, one of his main conflicts is he goes into the temple and he overthrows the tables. He judges it. So it's not simply me. I'm making the point that I think Dan's inconsistent there. All right. So, where have we? Okay, verse 15. We're going to get to the end here. In my vain life, this is the primary word that he uses over and over again, Hebel. Notice he says, I've seen everything. Again, he's operating as an empiricist, somebody who observes, who's seen. And here's his point. Let me pause. Bobby has a question. Let's see. I haven't heard my testimony. Did I feel called after that park bench day? Thank you for your question. So, real briefly, my testimony is I did not grow up in church. I don't ever recall a single discussion in my household about the existence of God. In fact, I remember in 8th grade, I had a teacher, Professor Yancey, and she was teaching about the universe. I just remember contemplating the universe and just how big and how vast it was, no existence of God. And that continued into high school. I never believed in God. So to answer your question, so then, around there, when I was around 20 years old, I began to chase a girl to church. She wouldn't go on a date with me unless I went to church with her. So we began to go to church, and I remember going there, and the youth pastor at the time was a student at the college that I went to. So he and I would spend time together, and man, I just thought he was naive. I could not trust his reasons for believing God. It didn't make sense to me. So we debated on mission trips. We debated on all sorts of trips. Just the existence of God didn't make sense. So through a variety of goalposts, if you will, I came to the belief in the existence of God. First was the cosmological argument made sense, and it wasn't anything he said. I happened to be up late one night watching a documentary, and the documentary had made the point that every effect in the universe has some underlying cause behind it. And I recognized that was true to my experience. Everything I have observed, every effect I've observed has had some sort of cause behind it. And therefore, I should not conclude that there should be any effect without some cause. That would go against what I've experienced. So it made sense to me that the universe had some sort of cause. So rationally, you would say, I began to think that, God does make sense. There had to be some sort of cause to the universe. That wasn't enough to make me believe, but it was at least enough to open me to some sort of understanding that God existed. Sometime at that point, that's when the girl and I had that conversation on the park bench. She'd asked me, looking at the stars, if I'd ever thought about God. And I said, no, it didn't make any sense. Whatever. I kind of set it aside for a couple years. But then as she and I broke up, and I began to realize there was some sort of slavery within me. I promised myself, hey, if she and I date, I would be happy. And that's when I began to wonder, why am I always promising myself this? I make myself promises that the universe does not offer to me. And I began to read scripture and to recognize, my heart's deceitful. My heart makes promises the universe doesn't make. And so I began to keep reading, and just recognize my heart will lie to me. And the more I studied scripture, the more I recognized, God would tell me the truth where my heart will not. But that's kind of a nutshell for now. Yeah. So let me try to wrap up these last few verses. In my vain life, I've seen everything. A righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. Here's the point in verse 15. Good people die early, wicked people die old. And so he's saying there that don't get it twisted. Just because you live a good life does not mean you're going to get longer days. And just because you live a wicked life doesn't mean you're going to get shorter days. There are wicked people who live into their 80s, and there are good people who live into their 20s and die. Verse 16, be not overly righteous. Don't make yourself too wise. Don't destroy yourself. Verse 17, be not overly wicked. Neither be a fool. Here's the point. Don't think that your experience has determined how righteous you are. Verse 17, however, don't think that you can live however you want without consequence. Right? You give yourself to drunkenness, you might die early because you've crashed your car. Rather, verse 18, what you really need to understand, take hold of this, withhold it. Don't, use your hands to grab hold of this. The one who fears God, that's who will come out from both of them. Both of what? Righteous and unrighteous living. I would argue this is an argument for justification by faith. You're saved not by how righteous you are. You're saved not by avoiding wickedness. You're saved by trusting in God alone. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just seeing my hand. I was painting with a member of our church earlier. I was helping to paint their church. That's what's going on there, all over my hand. But what the preacher's getting at here at the conclusion, righteous people can die early. I mean, you think of Jesus. He was in his 30s. He died on the cross. And then you can think of those who are wicked. Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. I had a friend who, when he was in college, was under the influence of alcohol and crashed his car and ended up killing several of his passengers. Why should you die before your time? The point being, there are real consequences for wickedness. But don't get it twisted. You need deliverance from thinking that your righteousness or your wickedness are how the world works. It's actually the one who fears God. You need to contemplate your Creator, is the point. Yeah, we were painting some. I had a friend or a member. They had purchased a house recently, and so I was helping paint this evening. But at the end of the day, what the preacher wants you to recognize is that the world operates not according to what man understands. You and I do not have all the answers. And so what you and I need to do is, instead of thinking of, oh man, I wish I could go back to the 90s, I wish I could go back to whatever, you and I need to recognize how limited our understanding is, right? I'd love to draw your attention again. Here's where the end of the book is going. Man, get out of that. Okay, man does not know what is to be. Ecclesiastes 8 verse 7. 8:17, man cannot find out the work that's done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 1, man does not know. 9 verse 12, man does not know his time. Ecclesiastes 10 verse 14, no man knows what is to be. 11 verse 2, you know not what disaster may happen. 11 verse 5, you do not know the work of God who makes everything. 11 verse 6, you do not know which will prosper. That's his point. You need a wisdom better than what you and I have. You just don't know. Any of you who think you can oppose God to your own success, you're so ignorant. You don't even know if you're going to get diagnosed with cancer next year. You have no reason to trust your own understanding, to think it's sufficient to determine whether or not God exists. So what you need is to recognize that things like death, suffering, sorrow are mercies from God to help you wake up before you make the wrong conclusion about the world. I'm going to end there and try to answer any questions that remain because we're 20 minutes over. I know this is off topic, but what would technically be the point of drinking other than trying to feel good, you know? So I do think, I actually don't remember the verse. There is a verse in the Psalms that talks about God giving wine to make glad man. And so when I say there's a purpose to drinking, I think there is something about God's kindness to us that he wants us to enjoy life. I'm not encouraging drunkenness. But according to the Psalms, wine is given to make man glad. So to the question, what would be the point of drinking? If there was any point, it was to recognize that God is kind, and he willfully gives us something that helps us to enjoy ourselves. Again, not endorsing drunkenness. And I wish I could tell you, let me see if I can find the verse. I apologize. But I don't have the verse at the top of my mind. Is that it? Psalm 104, verse 15. Yep, yeah. Thank you, Lucino Garcia. So according to Psalm 104, verse 15, I'll just go back to, no, not to my book, but to the Psalms. Sorry, my computer's kind of slow lately. Let's see. Whoop. Psalm 104, verse 15. Or maybe I typed something in wrong. How did I end up there? Okay. My computer's a little slower lately. That's what I'm noticing with my doing these live streams, is that I'm not quite as fast as I once thought it was. Okay. Psalm 104, verse 15. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock, and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. So when I say, something like alcohol could be good, the Lord clearly has designed it to gladden the heart of man. Again, I don't think that endorses drunkenness, but there is something about it that helps man to relax, and I don't think man is in sin to use it in that way. So that's all I've got for this evening. I'm going to pause there. We're actually, now we've passed the hinge of the book of Ecclesiastes. So as we continue, I just encourage y'all to recognize the first half of the book has really helped to deconstruct. The latter half of the book is going to try to, is to offer us an alternative to rebuild. And anybody, as you have comments, thoughts further, would love to discuss. But for now, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer any as I can. Yeah, Rhonda, that's a great point. Paul had no problem telling Timothy, hey, if your stomach's bothering, make sure you drink a little wine. Camcorder, we don't understand the entire universe, therefore God. No, actually, God, therefore, you and I have the ability to understand the universe. However, in humility, we recognize we can't exhaust the universe. Therefore, the wise thing to do would be to silence ourselves and depend upon God's revelation rather than our own understanding. Why does it have to be God? Because apart from him, you cannot justify anything at all. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate y'all's participation tonight. So, camcorder, to your question, you say you can put anything in that blank, including thousands of religions. I mean, you can say thousands of religions. All of them would include the same answer, namely God. So they would all give you the same answer, namely that the majority of humanity has always recognized belief about the supernatural. You're actually in the minority if you think that there isn't a supernatural explanation. Lucino Garcia, I failed you in that I did not look into further resources. So I'm going to write that down now as far as listening to sermons as a worship. And I really appreciate you checking up on that. I apologize for not checking on that for you. Yeah, let's see. Fermentation of wine help the stomach. Absolutely. God instructs the Israelites in the Pentateuch to sell their tithes, buy food and strong drink. Let's see. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your BJ. Appreciate you, Rhonda. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. I don't always feel that way, but I'm thankful if I've come off as patient that the Lord is kind. All right. Well, I'm about to head out because I need to go to bed. May the Lord bless you guys. Thank y'all for jumping in. We'll keep it up next week. Thanks, Lucino.